Welcome. I'm Janice Ellig, CEO and founder of Ellig Group, Executive Search Advisors, where we are reimagining search through our longstanding commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Thank you for joining me today for our webinar series with John Baird, published author and one of Silicon Valley's top executive coaches. Over the past 25 years, John has worked with prominent leaders at dozens of startups and Fortune 500 firms like Apple, Nike, and Twitter. He has founded several companies, including his current organization, Velocity Coaching, where he is presently chairman. This year, he published Leading with Heart, 5 Conversations that Unlock Creativity, Purpose, and Results, a book he co-authored with business partner Edward Sullivan. In this Wall Street Journal bestseller, John shares decades worth of research and experience that is proven to help leaders unlock the best version of themselves and those around them. During the next 60 minutes, we will cover many themes around leading with heart, something I'm very excited to get into with John today. I will take questions via the chat box, and if we don't answer all, we will share answers by email after the program. John and I go back many years, including serving on the National YMCA board together, and he is a strategic partner with Ellig Group, where our clients often want other services and offerings, and John and his team come in to provide that. So John, welcome. I'm so happy to have you with us today.
Oh, it's great to be here, Janice. We just finished a YMCA board meeting, and I was thinking how much we miss you at those meetings and how I miss our connection and our conversations.
Well, that's why we're doing this today, and you're a strategic partner with Ellig Group, right?
Yes.
So John, you've had 25 fabulous years. Again, many iconic leaders that you've coached at the Fortune 500 and startups. Why this book now? What prompted you and Edward to write it?
Well, I think after doing all the research for the book, because it was 2 years in the making, the book went up and down, went this way and went that way. But once we looked at all the data from the interviews, we looked at all the work we had done in the coaching world, we discovered that there were a number of things in common with people who lead with heart, with leaders who lead with heart. And that really boiled down to the conversations. They were able to have the difficult conversations. So we really sifted through the data and said, what were those conversations that were so critical for themselves to become better and transform themselves, their teams, and their organization? And it ended up being these 5 conversations that seem to sort out as being really critical to have.
Okay, so we're going to get into those 5 conversations. Yeah. But before we do that, we've heard a lot about the Great Resignation, the Great Belonging, what leaders need to do there. And it's all about not pay and benefits that people are leaving. And when they say, well, people are leaving for a better opportunity, even that suggests that there's something in the environment, right, of that organization. And you call it a toxic environment.
Yeah.
So what is happening in these toxic environments that we say, oh, people just going for better jobs? That's not really the case, is it?
No, it isn't. It's really what's not happening, actually, in those environments that need to happen. Most people that we, particularly as we interviewed people for this book, they don't leave because of pay or benefits, as you said, or all kinds of sort of bonuses they're given. Often people are given bonuses to stay. They're leaving because their voices are not being heard. They don't feel as though there's joy in their work. Their needs are not being met. There's a lot of anxiety in the world right now. We can talk a little bit about that because of so many things happening, but people want to feel connected to people, connected to their team, and connected to their leaders. So we find that leaders that lead with heart connect. And it's hard to connect. It's hard to have the connecting conversations. Oftentimes we find, Janice, that in teams where things are not happening and people are leaving, conversations about the important issues are not being had. People are afraid. They hold back. There's fear that what they say will not be, received well. It'll be judged. So we find that oftentimes those climates are often toxic climates. And that's the reason that people are often leaving.
So again, your book, Leading with Heart, and the subtitle is very important, is 5 Conversations that Unlock Creativity, Purpose, and Results. What are those 5 conversations, if you can sum up, and then we can go into some of the.
Yeah, right. Well, I mean, each chapter is about a conversation, right? And they're hard to have. I mean, these conversations are not easy. And the book talks a lot about how do you have these conversations and why are they important? So one is, what are your needs and what are the needs of your team? I would ask our listeners to say, have you asked people right now what they need? I mean, it's interesting. We have a reduction in the workforce. We have a lot of things going on in the work dynamic. We have people that are still there in those organizations. What do they need to be successful? What do you need? That's psychological needs, emotional needs, physical needs, space needs, all of that. As we come back to work, some people are not coming back to work. They're actually working at home still. How does that work? What do they need to make that work? And then we get into fears. What do people fear? We often think, Janice, that leaders don't fear anything. One of the things we found in our research is, the armor. We always think, the confidence that they show underneath it, they're all afraid of things. The perfectionist syndrome, the need for approval, the imposter syndrome with startup founders is just very rampant. So we talk a lot about freeze, fight, flight, the way we react to fear. And that's a conversation we could have more in depth in this session today. Our gifts, what are our gifts, right? What are the things that we're best at? And are you finding joy in those gifts? Are you being rewarded for the things that you're really good at? When are you at your best as a leader? Is that being realized and reinforced? What does your team look like? Does it look too much like you? We can talk a little bit about diverse teams because diversity matters, and maximizing and complementing your gifts with gifts that are different from your own. And then desires, that's the one that's really interesting. And what are my desires? That's a tough one to have written because we all have desires, some of which are really good to win and to make it. Sometimes those desires can take over and derail us. Overdone desires. We can talk more about that. And then finally, the chapter that I love, probably above all, I like them all, but purpose. What is my purpose? And are people realizing their purpose as they work on teams? And then what's our purpose of the organization? Today, people are so purpose-driven. So those are the five.
Yes, and as we're doing executive search work with companies, if they're purpose-driven, candidates want to flock to those authentic, purpose-driven companies and leaders. So you're so spot on with that. What I love about your purpose-driven chapter is that you also talk about your personal, coming to grips with what your purpose was, John, even though a really successful career, which then turned into velocity, right? That you share now.
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. And we got a lot of feedback from the publishers to share ourselves, because the book is a lot about being vulnerable and being able to share, naming fears. And so I got to a stage in my life where it was going well with my coaching firm. And it was, as you mentioned, started on early work at Apple and Nike and Twitter. It was more large company coaching. I enjoyed that work, but it became a little more of the same for me. And it was also very much in the tech world, which was great. It kind of got us started. I do miss the startup environment, right? And I love the ambiguity and the sort of chaos of startups. So I left my company and started a new company at a time when I didn't think Velocity would grow as much as it has. I did it because my passion was to help young founders who were sitting on a lot of money, invested by a lot of these investing firms, but had never been a C-suite executive, had never been a CEO before. Some of them had, but most of them not. And so taking young founders, a lot of millennial young founders, and giving them the skills to build and scale a company like DoorDash. We started with DoorDash as a company before they went public and coached that group and Tony all the way through. And I love the fact that they also got results and went public. So leading with heart is not just about soft skills and doing that well, but it's about those skills, getting results and building strong teams, and with people who stay and are retained in those companies.
So describe a little bit the difference in terms of coaching, and certainly a new CEO in a Fortune 500 or a startup is still a new CEO. He or she really has to learn the ropes of the game, so many things to it. How do you differ your coaching style or what you do with a Fortune 500 company leader versus a startup? Are there differences?
Yeah, there are a lot of differences, right? I mean, there's some leadership principles that transcend the journey of where a company is. but velocity coaches very differently with early stage, middle stage startups, late stage going public, and then companies that are public. With public companies, you always have to work more on communication, embedding culture. The leader has to be about culture, and because people that are coming to the organization, they don't know all the stuff around how the company was founded. So you have to continue to reinforce those messages as you go through. I often find that in large companies, innovation is not where it needs to be. It's like CEOs will say, I wish we could be more innovative. Apple's a good example. Apple has stayed very flat. Tim Cook's philosophy is, I think, and Steve Jobs the same way. Let's keep everything flat so that iTunes has to talk to iPad, has to talk to iPhone. We're not going to create this hierarchy. I worry when later stage, companies that are public, they get very hierarchical. And as a result, it takes too long to make decisions. It's not flat enough, and innovation doesn't really occur. In the startup world, it's natural, it's chaotic. And so we have to bring a little more structure and process. When do they do OKRs? When do they make things accountable for people? How much process to put in place? How far along is the product market fit? All those decisions really impact how much process. You can overdo process too early with startups. So it's a interesting dance around coaching.
Now, I'm going to quote you. You say that pseudo participation in communications does not make for a successful company. Could you explain that both in the startup and the Fortune 500? Pseudo participation in communications does not make for a successful company. What does that mean?
Yeah. Well, this is one, Janice, that we talk about a lot with groups making decisions. Oftentimes, leaders will go in with the idea that we want input from people, right? And yet the leader, he or she has already made up their mind. So they go through this process of getting all this input and providing all of this engagement, et cetera, all this feedback. And then the leader decides, here's what I want to do. And often the people will say, well, why didn't you tell us that in the first place? There's a lot of pseudo participation going on, I think, in organizations, both in large companies, I think, and in startups. So we'll often advise in our coaching people to say, be clear on your decision rules. Say things like, Janice, this is a decision that I've already made, but I'm not sure how to implement it. I'm not sure exactly the timing of it. Could you give me feedback on that? Or I think I've made this decision, but I'm not sure yet. Tell me all the reasons why it's good or bad, or give me other alternatives. Or I'm not bringing this decision to you. I've already made it. So be clear on where you are around that. Don't pseudo the whole thing. Just be honest and transparent, which is all of what Leading with Heart is about. Just be honest and transparent and build that trust. Trust is what's missing, I think, in a lot of teams and organizations.
What's interesting about the book too, John, is you talk about what leaders can do, maybe should do, what employees need. It's both from the leader's perspective as well as the employee's perspective. And you tie those together really well with some phenomenal examples. So given these 5 conversations that you have with leaders and where they need to, be better, are they struggling with some of these in parts of these conversations? Are there things that are really difficult for them to sort of be more vulnerable, to admit, hey, just some of this discussion, I haven't made this decision yet. Help me think through, or how could we do that? Are they struggling with vulnerability?
Oh, yeah, I think so. It's very, very hard. And Brene Brown has made that sort of more okay, but it's still hard. It's the hard part of leading with heart. I have an example of that, Janice, that might be interesting to share with the listeners. It's one that I don't talk about in the book, but it's one that is just really on my mind right now. But it's an individual. The investors came to me and asked if I would coach this individual, right? And I said, yes. We had a conversation. The person really had gotten some feedback, had done a 360 and gotten some feedback that they were very controlling. This is also a company that has done very well, led by a very strong product leader, engineering type who just had all the right answers and always had, and again, all the right answers early stage was really important, getting the product where it was. Well, now getting ready to go public, they're hiring new leaders and who had come from other large companies. And so his C-suite team looked very different. And so I observed a team meeting. And I don't know, Janice, if you can imagine, I was a fly on the wall. He introduced me. I said nothing and watched him conduct a meeting. Can you imagine, Janice, what I found?
Tell us.
Oh, I mean, it was like nobody talked very much. He talked most of the time. When people did talk, he was very quick to judge and say, that's wrong. He evaluated things a lot. There were people in the room that spoke. It was an hour-long meeting, and those who never spoke at all. He tended to lean towards certain people in the group. They spoke a little bit more, but others didn't. Oh, they were reluctant to share information. They just hid information. It was not a group that was actually performing at a high level at all. So we had to peel back the onion. I gave him this feedback, and he was just really taken back by the feedback, very hard feedback, saying, you've got to change this. There's no way these people are going to stay. And Janice, when I interviewed people after the observation, 3 of them said they're thinking about leaving. Oh my gosh, the kiss of death around going public with 3 of these key leaders leaving. I mean, that would just not be something on the street that would play well at all. So we peeled back the onion, and long story short on this one, perfectionist syndrome, had to get everything right. This was somebody, Janice, that never pleased his father.
Yeah.
Never pleased his father. And naming that fear and why he needed to control everything, to be right, to prove it to. And then again, getting him to name the fear, be vulnerable in the group, change that around, created an environment where people were more open. We got through it. That company actually is ready to go public. So, so there you go.
So you took a negative situation. He did listen to you.
He did. He did.
Are there times when you find that people don't, and that fear-based leadership style takes longer? So people hold back the bad news, they're not open, turnover goes higher.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No, it does. You see that. And again, the book talks about some stories that some cautionary tales. It's like it doesn't always work out right. You can give them all that feedback, but there are some people that are so just wired so deeply around some of these desires and these fears for themselves that they can make what I call 1 degree of change for a while, but then they revert back, and then the company eventually, in many cases, Janice, it catches up to those leaders. And boards either change out those leaders, and sometimes those people go on the board, the CEOs, but it often sometimes does not always end in a positive way. But we have good results, and I will take, in some cases, 1 degree of change. I'll take it.
Right. Because you're really looking for them to unleash, what's holding them back, right?
Yes.
And so that they can help others unleash what's holding them back and really their
That's
gifts.
a great point. They have to name it. In the book, we talk about naming fears, naming those things that you're really afraid of, and doing that in a story way, which kind of says, I haven't done this right. We have to reset this. I want to reset this team. Here's why I want to reset. Here's what I've discovered. I want you to be more open. Again, Janice, when people are not open and honest and transparent and not saying what they think, it affects the product. Things get released that are not right. There's a bottom line result to trust, transparency, and openness. So again, Edward and I often say leading with heart is just not about, just leading with the heart. It's having those difficult conversations, being vulnerable. And that also translates into successful teams and successful products at the end.
Whether it's a not-for-profit board or a for-profit, that board really needs to hone in on that leadership in terms of the culture, what the culture would, and people have not paid attention to that as much as they are now. I find that boards are much more attuned with what's happening culture-wise. What is the turnover like? What are people saying? And you're right, so you could produce a product that's the wrong product at the wrong time, at the wrong price, in the wrong geography, right? Because people have not spoken up. And oftentimes our frontline workers know more than we know as the leaders, right? So how do you set leaders on this path of discovery? Because I'd love to be able to talk to some leaders about that, because I think that that's really important. Self-discovery, so you can unleash your, potential and the potential of all of your employees, and then the potential of the company. That's what it's all
Yes,
about.
yes,
The
yes.
organization, not just the
Yeah.
company, the organization. Yeah.
I love the word discovery. And it's interesting, when we get clients, we get a lot of the stars. So we often coach the stars, so to speak. And when they come to us with a little bit of pain and a willingness and some feedback they've gotten that, oh my gosh, I don't want that. I want to build a culture that's different. So if there's a willingness, an interest in self-discovery and reflection, and the abilities there. So willingness and ability together. And again, most of the people we coach, Janice, have the ability. But when I get a client that doesn't seem to have that willingness, right, that awareness for discovery, and doesn't create that, to your point, in the organization, oftentimes when we do work with the CEO, we often do work with his or her team. And sometimes it goes down through the organization. We've done a lot of work with companies where the process of self-reflection, discovery, and leadership development just goes right down through. Apple, for example, when you get into a very high role, they give you a coach. They don't give you a coach when things are not working well, most of the time. Most of the time, it's done when you're in a big role, and it's almost like a gift. I think the gift of coaching and self-discovery is the gift. It's a gift of joy. I mean, to have that opportunity to step back and look at yourself and do that early in your career. Oh my gosh, that's why I started Velocity. And Edward came along, and Edward has just added so much to that. And he brings just such vitality and life, particularly to the startup work that, and I think you can see that in the book, in the stories, particularly the startup stories about Bombas, and some of the socks. I don't know whether our listeners wear Bombas socks, but Bombas starts the book and ends the book. And that's one of Edward's clients that we love.
So this road to discovery, self-discovery, and then,
Yeah.
And you see this little sign I have behind me, be the change. People really don't like to change. So this really does require a lot of self-reflection. It does require that vulnerable, being vulnerable to your team. When you're starting this with somebody, does it take, it's sort of like therapy, or maybe does it take a month, 2 months, 3 months? Is it different for everybody? And do people wait around? Do the employees see the changes happening? How does one show others that you're trying to change to make the whole environment better?
Yeah. Oh, there's so much there in that question. It's like, I think that I do find that the journey is different for people. I have coached CEOs in 3 different companies, for example. They started one, sold one, another one, another one. And I have a client that was the case. And the evolution of the leadership through that journey was unbelievable. It was like the first process of holding up the mirror, the second process of holding up the mirror, more experience, a little older, just gaining it. I mean, the growth was unbelievable. I've had clients where the DNA around some of these things we talk about in the book is so strong that they don't get it until they crash and burn, until something really happens in their life. And sometimes for people like that, it's personal. It's like it's something that happens very painfully, and they realize that they have to change in their personal life, and it does affect their professional life as well. It's a journey, and it's different for most people. If you go into it with the idea that you want to be open to feedback that you may hear that you've never heard before or doesn't fit your image of yourself, that's hard. It's hard because you've lived that image for so long. So as coaches, we have to support that, guide that, make incremental changes. This is a good change to make now. Guide them along, support them, give them feedback when it's not working. It's a continual process of just learning, discovery, growth, and holding up the mirror all the way along.
So describe what you do so well in the book about psychological safety. That's really important for building a strong culture.
Yeah.
What that means on the part of the leader and for the employees.
Well, it's an important concept, and it's emotional safety is so key. When we talk about people leaving organizations and toxic environments, it's all about psychological safety. If you don't feel safe, you're not going to show up in the right way. We have this concept that we call the left-hand column. I don't know whether you know about that, but the right hand is what is being said, Janice, around the table. You know, what's being said. The left hand is what is being thought, but not being spoken. So research at Harvard and MIT, this comes out of some work by Peter Senge, but it's been sort of, worked on by others. The more left-hand columns, what people are thinking but not saying in a group, as long as it's respectful and constructive, the more high-performing the team is. I will tell you that there are too many teams with not enough left-hand columns. And the leader has to learn how to value the feedback, particularly if the feedback is feedback that goes against his or her sort of perception of the world. We have this concept that we call, rather than react, become curious. I don't know that concept, rather than react, become curious. So when you get feedback that goes against your self-image, the first reaction is really to defend it. Like, that's not right, or where'd you hear that? Or that's not true, or, that's not how I see myself at all. You defend it, you judge it. When you do that, you stop communication in the group so fast. You're never going to get any left-hand columns at all. So we say, when you get negative feedback, get curious. When you get a negative feedback that says something like, I hate the way these meetings go. These meetings are not very constructive at all. I find myself not wanting to show up to an executive team meeting. Wow, saying this to the CEO. How are you going to react to that? If you're curious, you probably will say things like, say more about that. Boy, it sounds like you don't want to be at these meetings. Yeah, I don't want to be at these meetings. Peel it back. Get curious about those thoughts. The more you do that, and then you want to do something with it, don't want to get curious just to get curious. And there's probably that feedback is probably from other people than just that person. But we talk a lot about leading with heart is creating safety by getting curious and allowing voices, which may be different than your own, to be heard and to value that in the group. So it's hard to get curious and not react.
Well, but somebody brings a problem to you as a leader, you say, well, that's a problem. Let's talk about the solution. So sometimes you say, you brought me the problem, and let's talk about what the solution could be, as opposed to be just defensive about it, right? I would say, if you think something's not working right, tell me how it should work.
Yeah. Well, and on the other hand, Janice, I think we can jump to solution too quickly. It's very interesting how becoming curious, it's like, I think I find a number of leaders, they do like solutions. They come with your solutions, but we haven't unpeeled the problem. Say more about that. What's an example of that? What did that customer actually say? Did we find that feedback with others? Did other customers say that? Let's get curious about the problem. I always say to groups, what's the problem we're trying to solve here? Let's talk about that a little bit. Let's not jump to solution quickly. Let's get to solutions and actions for sure. I mean, meetings that don't conclude with actions are not constructive meetings, but I do find it's interesting to analyze and come up with solutions, sometimes too quickly.
That's really interesting, because I think as leaders, we always want to go quickly, right? We want to make it happen. And the results are the outcome.
Yes.
You don't reflect and say, what are we really solving for and why? It's always that why question, right?
Yeah.
So we have some questions from our audience.
Great.
So put one out there. When working with these new CEOs' fears, how do you reorient their perspective towards a purpose that reinforces their values?
A purpose that reinforces their values with their fears, purpose, and values.
And when working with these new CEOs, their fears.
Yeah.
So there's a new CEO. How do you reorient their perspective towards a purpose that reinforces their values? I guess saying they haven't maybe defined their purpose, right?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot there, right? It's a really good question. That's just to unpack that. I think, first of all, to help them understand their fear and to name that fear, to begin there. And the book talks about naming a fear. I gave the example of the fear of disappointing a father or a parent. Boy, I tell you, some of the fears go deep for people. And then I think once that's uncovered, is there a way to connect that to one's purpose? I think we have a personal purpose, but we also have an organizational purpose. And those purposes, I think, have to be defined clearly. Not everybody's purpose on the team is the same as the CEO's purpose. I hope there's, Janice, a purpose that is bigger than all our that collectively we want to climb that hill. We want to, take care of that disease. I work with a lot of biotech companies, and their purposes are very clear. They're very mission driven around patients and healthcare and making people better and saving lives and inventions for all of that, whether it's diabetes or cancer or whatever. So the purpose is clear. And many times those CEOs have stories. One of them is in the book, Jeff Huber, the founder of Grail, who talks about his wife dying of cancer. Oh, that story is so powerful and all that. I mean, I think his purpose for founding Grail came out of that experience. And he tells that story so beautifully. So again, kind of connecting purpose with what you're all about. I think that's just personal purpose, but the purpose of Grail was also there as well. So connecting all that together so you have individual, but also a broader sense of organizational purpose.
And John, you say in the book too, conflict is good. Conflict is healthy. And, we can't always all agree. So talk a little bit about how you manage conflict, particularly if somebody is disagreeing with the strategy or whatever the company of the leader or the organization is trying to do. How do you manage conflict in a productive way?
Yeah.
Productive.
Yeah. And you're thinking about, Janice, with your question, what are some of those strategies?
Yeah.
What are some kind of concrete things that people might do to manage that?
Mm-hmm.
Right. I think it's all around the conversation. I mean, there's so much in other books too around having difficult conversations, because managing conflict is about difficult conversations. And often the left hands are not being communicated. It's like we talk about ways that we want to improve this problem, but we're not really talking about the fact that you don't treat me very well when we talk together. I feel like I'm not smart enough. I feel like I'm demeaned in our conversations one-on-one with each other. You do all the talking, I do all the listening. Are we really talking about things that are really motivating why the conflict is really there? Because underneath all of that, we act out. Sometimes it's passive aggressive. If we're not talking about the real issues, we'll be passive aggressive and not come to meetings, or go behind people, the backstabbing that goes on. I'll go to the boss, right? I'll go to the leader of the group rather than directly to the person. We act out those things. And yet, if we're able to confront the person directly and be able to say, using what I call I messages, I really want our relationship to be better. I feel like this works well with us. I feel like this is not working well with us. Mm-hmm. What do you think? Get curious about the other person and vice versa. Now, sometimes, Janice, we actually coach this. I mean, I have been asked in my coaching career to work with two executives that are high level in the organization that are not getting along. And the goal is just have them be civil to each other in meetings, right? And it's about conflict, but it's getting to the root of the conflict and having that difficult conversation and having the confidence to use strategies that will get to the right place, and asking questions like, what would be a good way for us in moving forward? What would be a good solution for you? Become oriented to ways that we can actually work better together. If you would just do this one thing for me, that would be great. What one thing could I do for you? And so having those conversations about those things can be very helpful.
Another great question. Leaders seem unsure and nervous about asking what employees need, at times because they may not be able to fulfill what folks feel they need. What advice do you have about having those conversations openly and being clear about what's possible and what's not? Mainly, things like in terms of return to office or pay or promotion, so there may be boundaries of what a leader can do, can't do, but let's have an open conversation about what you need as an employee, or maybe what you need from me. So how would you advise this listener?
Yeah. What would you say to that one, Janice?
Well, I do think you do need to be clear, about what you're able to do. But I always think, the greater the transparency, the more communication, that you have with an employee, the better. Sometimes we're always constrained because legally isn't the right conversation to have, But if you have what you were saying before, openness and trust and respect, and you're authentic with people, I think it's a two-way street. They are with you. We say when we're presenting candidates, it's as much your decision as it is our
Yes.
client's
The
decision.
client's decision, right?
Is this
Yes.
the right culture for
Reciprocal.
you?
Yeah.
Right? We want to
Yeah.
make sure it's a great marriage. And so I think you just have to have boundaries. What's your view on that in terms of what you
Oh,
can
I
do,
think
what you can't do?
I think it's a great question. And I think leaders often misstep. Whoever answered that question, they often misstep. I think you answered the question. I would only add to it, and you use the word boundaries, is that leaders have to hear the needs. They have to understand them. The voices have to be heard. And oftentimes we find that people don't feel like they're really heard. That people are not curious about what's really going on there around that need. So have you really listened with empathy? Right. And so that's where you start with it. And then leaders have to have boundaries. I mean, I'm working so much right now with the CEOs I work with on clarity of what it's like coming back to work. What's it going to be in coming back to work? What are the boundaries of it? So you can listen to it. I hear all that. And you can begin to say, we're not going to do this. We are going to do this. We've heard this on all the engagement surveys. This must change. And here's what we're doing about the change. These are things that are not going to show up. You're not going to see these now. We're at a place right now where we can't do that. Honesty with people around what you can do and not do really goes a long way.
So I'm going to switch now over to the work environment, because many companies, I was at a major bank yesterday, and they're in 5 days a week, not 3, 5 days a week. And the work environment is fabulous. It's all open, great views. I wanted to stay there.
You liked it.
I liked it. Yeah. And, I recently at the Economic Club interviewed Sarah Armbruster, who's the CEO of Steelcase. And she made the point that we don't just sell furniture, chairs, we sell designs for workplace so that individuals and collectively, they will feel inspired. It'll bring out and unleash their best creativity, their innovation. So it's really about designing a workplace and work site that really speaks to the employee. And that's what I found yesterday when I was visiting this major bank. And you bring out in the book, which I think is so well done, about painters like Claude Monet and Jackson Pollock, and they painted visually of the scenery that they were in. So
and the setting they were in, right? To do that.
So
yeah.
It's Ponds and Giverny, the town in France, right? That Monet painted. We have those pictures, right? And Jackson Pollock was the trees, the branches of the Hamptons. And so they unleash their creativity in paintings by their surroundings.
Yes.
So you're saying the same thing about that work environment, aren't you?
Yeah, I think we are. And we can look at lots of examples of companies that have been designed that way. I mean, when you go, I'm still doing work at Apple. And when you go to the spaceship, I mean, I don't think Steve Jobs ever got to see the final spaceship, but there's so much space. It takes so long to walk from one office to the other in that environment. But in the process, you get to sort of think, and it takes about 5 or 10 minutes to walk, and you get breathers and all of that. I'm a big believer that we need to mix up the space at times. We need to take that walk. I mean, in the book, we talk about taking a walk with our clients. And there's a couple examples of breakthroughs on walks. And I don't know what it is, but when you walk with a client, you're both looking straight ahead down the street. And people just, Janice, disclose more, maybe because they're not looking for you, but we get many personal things when people, I don't know, are not looking at each other. Maybe this is more, I don't know, unique to some people than others. I don't know, but changing that up just gets us some very rich conversation. Steve Jobs, I mentioned him before, but when they had sort of stuck on things with the iPhone, I never got to see these environments, but the word was that he would just take people off-site into an environment, and he would, make it an environment that was very conducive. He would almost, in some ways, lock them up for days to work on solving this particular problem around the phone. He was a genius in creating space and the detail of how space mattered in being creative. And we see that in a lot of environments that we work in. So I'm a great believer in that. Yes.
So John, do you see, you and Edward, basically in your search practice and consulting practice, do you see a change happening in terms of leaders recognizing some of these major issues that are happening because there are people leaving, that they're not as productive? Are leaders concerned that they're on the Fortune 500 list now, but they may not be in 20 years,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
we've seen this, right?
Yeah.
So how to stay relevant?
Yeah.
Is this a major concern that you're dealing with your clients?
Well, it's a must. You cannot build a really strong company where people are productive, high performing, and are retained without being concerned about leading with heart. It just has to be there. It's not just the bottom line. The bottom line is affected very much by people leaving. When people leave, you have to hire. Hiring is expensive, as you know, right? It's all of that. So you can translate the ROI to that. That's why we see, Janice, so many more engagement surveys. We work a lot. Culture Amp is one of the engagement surveys that we use a lot. Pulse surveys in organizations, just getting tuned in to where employees are. CEOs need to actually, and C-suite executives need to look at that data. So yes, I think it's happening more. The mirror is being held up through data. More investors are looking at this as a dashboard for looking at success. Retention is an ROI dimension, and engagement survey data of how people feel about the company. All of that translates into the bottom line. So yes, I think there's more awareness than ever. It's just not a nice to have around all of this. It's a must now.
So you and I both know Lily Gilvalet, who's also a strategic partner with
Yes.
with you. And she has this proprietary algorithm product where she can scrape the universe and find out what employees really say.
Yeah.
And it's unvetted, unbiased.
Yeah.
Are leaders more attuned to listening to these, to unbiased views of what employees are saying, employee centimeters, so to speak? Do they want to do that? Are they even going on listening tours more to hear what frontline people? Are you seeing this in the work?
Well, we're certainly coaching that. When engagement survey data comes back, what I worry most about, Janice, around that is that leaders and organizations are good at getting feedback, and they're good at doing it again and yet again 6 months later. And then employees say, what's been done? We gave this message before. Either tell us it's not going to happen,
right,
or do something about it because it's been said a million times. So I'm very concerned. Don't survey and ask people. This is that pseudo participation thing, unless you plan to do something about it. So I'm very interested in surveying less, but showing more that we're doing these things. And we'd like your feedback on how to implement these things better, engage the employees in a plan for improving these things in the organization, not just around people stuff, but around the way product discussions happen and just all of that. I do see skip levels happening more where the CEO, and I advise people a lot on this, go down through the organization and have meetings with different groups. It's kind of a listening tour. It's really important because oftentimes, even in surveys, you don't hear the full story. You need to be face-to-face with that team and hear how that team is feeling about what's going on. And sometimes without the leader present as well.
Right. And sometimes the leader may hear it and makes a conversation with somebody who reports to him, but other leaders, it doesn't filter down or cast.
It doesn't filter down through the organization, for sure. Right. I love the concept, Janice, that actually it's a concept that Tim Cook has come up with called being a leader of leaders. I think the good CEOs are getting their leaders, their C-suite, to be leaders of other leaders. For example, I have a number of CEOs that oftentimes are at the center of too much, right? They try to control too much, right? It's like what I call, Janice, the hub and the spoke. It's like everything comes into the leader. And the leader hears everything about everybody else, and they backstab and they come to the leader, et cetera, rather than having a conversation that I want this to change. We have to have these conversations collectively. I want you all to be leaders of leaders. You have those conversations. You cascade that down. You build purpose, build trust in your teams, right? Become a leader of leaders. I love that concept. I don't think it's in the book, but it's one that when Tim Cook talks about leadership, he often talks about being a leader of leaders at Apple across the organization, the different functions.
No, I think that's really important. And when you say surveys, and then you don't do anything about it, I'm going to point to the McKinsey Lean In survey. They do it every year, about, where are women in the pipeline, where are underrepresented groups in the pipeline, the leaky pipeline, they come in at a lower level, they drop out in the mid-level and never get up to the C-suite in the boardroom. And so we keep looking at this data every year. You have to say, what are we doing to truly
what are we doing to
diversify?
change that? It's
So
huge.
how important is diversification from your perspective in coaching so many leaders, startups, to Fortune 500 all along the way? What is the importance of diversification?
It's probably one of the most important things to look at productivity on teams. When you look at McKinsey's study on why diversity matters, it's not just a nice thing to have diversity in terms of ethnicity and gender, et cetera. And there's so many different kinds of diversity these days, but it actually results in a better product. The outcome is always better. The interesting caveat with that, Janice, is it always takes longer to get through decisions because the styles are different. But having those stories, cultural differences, ethnicity differences, experiences around the table and allow that to, and so I don't work with enough diverse teams. It is a constant conversation where I'll say, this team is not diverse enough. I'm looking at around the table and too many people look like the leader. In Silicon Valley, it's a little bit different, but I see boards. I would like the investor boards I work with to be more diversified, particularly persons of color. So this is for me something that is a very high priority for Velocity. And our coaches, we have a really diverse group of coaches because we want to match people with more diversity because there's learning that happens there as well. So for me, it's probably the number one thing that I don't see in teams. I don't see enough diversity, and it does matter.
And that's why we're strategic partners, because you brought in certain situations where we'll say the supply is there. You just have to know where to look. And oftentimes these PE firms, VC firms, startups don't know where to look, and they do need help, right? Because there are great women and underrepresented groups. All backgrounds that could
and Janice, you've been just mentioning the Y board. I mean, just for our listeners, Janice and I both work with board development, which is recruiting on the national board. And you were a champion for diversity. And that board is one of the most diverse boards that I'm on. I'm on 2 other boards, and this one is one. And you were a big part of that. I mean, you just kept championing different kinds of people on the board. And boy, has that made a difference in the conversation. It's not just a nice to have, the conversations are different. And if we allow voices to be heard and bring those conversations in and have enough space, I find, Janice, in executive meetings, there's not enough time spent on the critical issues. It's show and tell too much. I want 1 or 2 topics. You can tell a little bit. You can tell me send me an email and tell me that. But I also feel like it's conversations need to be more in depth. And so spend time on fewer topics and allow people to share in depth.
John, you're hitting on a really big point that I see in some of the boards that I sit on in terms of what are the big ideas out there? What are we looking at to be for tomorrow? When we look at this strategic plan, it's not a document that sits on a shelf, right? It's a living, breathing way of operating for what that future state is going to be. If you don't think about the future state today, you're not going to get there, right? And so if you're always into a show and tell or a dog and pony, that is not, those are transactions, those are activities. What's the purpose? What's the outcome, right? I mean, and so
I think that drives, there's not enough purpose outcome driven strategic plans. They do sit on shelves too much, but we're pushing that. That's changing. Most of the startups I work with, they have their 2- and 3-year plans out there, but they also have the 1 year, and they also have the quarter plan, and they also have the 2 quarters, and we have the war room plan. I mean, there's a lot going on right now with the world, right? The economy is not great, the recession, we have companies that are retrenching, we have companies laying off employees, et cetera. And so you don't forget your purpose, though. I mean, if people are leaving or we're doing rifts, with the organization, what about those people who are still with us? Are we still being purpose-driven? Is the company still about what it's about? Yes, you don't lose that purpose, right? Let's remind people of that as we go forward. So anyway, that's part of the planning as well. But I like 1, 2, 3 years. And then I like in that 1 year, breaking it down to quarterly and then tracking the progress as we move forward.
Well, that's what you said earlier. Any meeting where you don't have an action plan coming out of it, is it worth the meeting?
Yeah,
Right? So
exactly.
you have to have those
Yeah.
action steps of what
Yeah.
you're going to do to improve it.
Yeah.
Talk to us a little bit about gratitude moments.
Well, I think it's interesting in the gifts chapter, which I really like that chapter as well, thinking about what it is that people are good at. I always have the saying, and this is interesting for your listeners, if about 70 to 80% of the time you're doing something that you find joy in, oh, celebrate that. That's great. If it's 80-20, 20%, you're doing things that you just don't, I mean, everybody's going to have stuff you don't like, but if it's reversed, or if you're just dreading going in, that is time to really say, what's going on here? Have that conversation. If you're really a high-performing employee, but you're not finding joy in your job, you've been there a long time, it's great to have that conversation as well. Gratitude moments are interesting because it's oftentimes we don't get feedback on the things that are working, right? If you ask somebody, Janice, to list the things that they're good at, they can't come up with them. It's like, oh, I don't know, I think I'm good at this. You ask them what you're not good at, they have a list of 10. What is that? What is that about our society, right? So one of my clients established this gratitude moment. And what he does at every staff meeting, he assigns a peer, and this is a C-suite, a CEO with executives around the table. So he assigns each one at each meeting to have something positive to say about every peer around the table.
Ooh.
So during that week that they're assigned, Janice, they have to find something. They have to find something. Well, it has been amazing. The peer group is working so much better together. By the way, this was the team that had some issues around peers, stabbing peers and not working well. He finds the team dynamic so much better with this feedback. And it's simple. It's 10 minutes. They just spend, Janice, really like the way you did this. This was really important to me. And that customer was so sad. And they go around the table. Very quick, but very powerful moment. It changed the dynamic of that team.
You know, we have something called gratitude cards that a friend gave to me. And so we stopped doing it. We're going to start it again because you just pick a card and then you talk about something that's on that card. You know, what is the greatest gift I have? Or growing up, what did I most fear? And you know, it opens you up a little bit to, again, being vulnerable with your peers, but we're all doing it. We're all taking a card. And
That's powerful.
Gets a conversation going and some laughs too.
Oh yeah, the conversation, what it's really all about. And he has found that by having the gratitude moments, people will say, oh my gosh, I didn't know you thought that way about me. And people get more open and more honest to work with their peers outside of the team. And that's the dynamic that he's seen as very, very powerful. Yeah.
Are there any leaders, and there were many that you talked about, that you would say really exemplify what good leadership was about, or that they changed? Maybe you want to say it with a name, not a name, I don't know, but you name people in the book and what they did to really make a difference in the company.
Yeah. I think the one that comes to mind is the one that that we gave a lot of feedback to, that some of the behaviors that were happening in the room in terms of not valuing the comments of other people and not allowing those voices to be heard. And just, it was so powerful for him to be able to step back a little bit and be able to hear that feedback. And he was devastated by that because he didn't see himself that way at all. The difference between the self concept and how the data said it was and the observation was, and this was a very, very successful company that had done well. And he had a good track record, but it was very humbling. And I think because he was very humble about it and really responded and made some changes, it also changed his personal life. He had some things going on in his life. You know, it's interesting. We have life challenges right now. We have, should we go back to work? We have parents at home. We have more COVID going on. We have the war. We have the recession. We're asking, will I have a job? My kids are not doing very well here or there. So it's like it caused him to raise a lot of issues around a personal thing at home that really caused him, I think, to sort of change his personal behavior. And he said to me, I want to leave a legacy, not so much that this company was really successful, but I want people to say later on, I loved working on that team with you.
Yeah, I think, sometimes we have great images of leaders on the outside.
Yeah.
And, they're perfectionists almost, and they can give a speech like no one else. But inside, that perfectionism is getting in the way of their effective leadership. Authenticity has to really come into play here, and leveraging their gifts and the gifts of others.
Yeah.
So we're going to have to close soon. I could go on for hours. This is such a great book, John. And I'm going to reread it. It's not a book you just read cover to cover. I mean, you have to go through it and read it, and you have to stop and reflect and think about it. So as you reflect on what you and Edward put together here, what are some takeaways, 1, 2, or 3 big takeaways for our audience?
Yeah.
That they can put into play tomorrow.
Yeah, there's a lot of takeaways. At the end of each chapter, there's lots of questions. And I would say with the needs chapter, the fears chapter, the gifts, et cetera, you can ask those questions of yourself and your team. I think the number one takeaway, is get connected with your team, get feedback, have conversations. If you don't know exactly how to have them, get help. Get help from HR, chief people officers, get a coach, talk to someone about it, but connect. People are starved for connections. They want to be asked, what do you need to be successful? Are you finding joy in your work? What could I do to support you better? It's a great question, to ask as a leader. So I would just say connect. We're starved for connection. It's connection and conversation that's going to result in team performance that's high and also cultures that thrive. That's the advice I would give. Have conversations and connect.
That's great advice, John. You are a remarkable leader in the company that you have founded, and then now with John as a partner. And I think that going forward, more and more are going to be reading your book and saying, this is something that I'm going to be implementing every week. I'm going to reflect on what I did last week. What do I need to do this week? Because I think if we don't reflect, we're just on this treadmill, trying to get out there and make things happen, right? And so your book is sort of an action plan for outcomes, right?
Yes, I agree. I think there's a lot of actions you can take that are summarized at the end of each chapter, for sure.
So if people want to buy your book or they want to connect with you, how do they do that?
Well, it's on Amazon, and we're very excited about the reviews on Amazon and with the Wall Street Journal. And we're also, they can connect by, getting me at john@velocitycoaching.com. We'd be happy to have a connection with you if that would be important to do. We have 26 coaches worldwide. Edward and I have really built a very exciting firm, very established in Silicon Valley, but now all over the world. Our coaches are all over the world. So it'd be great to connect with anybody who's interested in just what you said, stepping back and looking at their leadership. Yes, and their teams.
And you are on the Wall Street Journal list of bestsellers, right? I mean, that's quite an accomplishment.
Yes. We're very excited about that. Yes.
That's huge, John. Congratulations. So
Thank you.
We're going to be working together more as we go forward with our clients who will need your advice and counsel and wisdom. And I can't thank you enough for just putting together a phenomenal book that I'm going to send to many who, are great leaders, but everybody needs a refresher. Everybody needs a reminder. It reminded me, I actually told one of my employees today, you have the gift of this. And he was surprised. I mean, he said, I never heard somebody say that to me. I got it from your book.
Putting it into practice, right?
Into practice. And then I did say, now we're going to work on these things, but these are your gifts, And so I think everybody has so many gifts and we undervalue them sometimes, don't we?
Yeah, we do.
We really need to capitalize on. So thank you so much for joining us. To our audience as well, thank you for being with us today to hear John Baird on his new book with Edward Sullivan, Leading with Heart, 5 conversations that unlock creativity, purpose, and results. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, John Baird.
Thanks for having me, Janice. It was delightful.